15 years ago, the MCU was, to a degree any big expensive Hollywood movie thing can be, the weird, new, different, nerdy outsider thing, and now it's literally the Disney Channel. It's McDonald's, the suburbs, soccer moms, and hybrid SUVs. I mean, shit, my mom knows that there are two people called Hawkeye and has differing but positive opinions about each of them. In that context, sections of the pop commentariat either tuning out or turning aggressively against the most mainstream thing in the mainstream isn't evidence of cultural fatigue, but evidence of cultural entrenchment. But that's really part of the problem, isn't it? The original strain of persecution pathology, once unique to the American psyche, wherein a culture that originates from a mythology of being a rebellious underdog becomes the overwhelmingly dominant culture, but can't let go of that origin myth and still needs to imagine itself as eternally threatened, leading to increasingly delusional paranoia now exported worldwide through our pop media into the specific venue of fandom, in the same way that conservative media pundits who've bleated on for decades about America losing power in the world, and meanwhile the American way, in terms of the real meaning of the word for better or worse, utterly dominating the planet, because, look, Republic, Conserva, MAGA, Sorophile, whatever you're calling yourselves this cycle, we've been over this, the world loves America, it just doesn't like you. Nobody likes you. On these same lines, way too much of the nerd culture discourse still comes down from a paradigm that imagines itself as the sole and sufficient voice of authority over material that isn't just a substrata of mainstream pop culture or adjacent to mainstream media, but has completely subsumed both of those things, even though that is very much the case, whereas a decade or two ago it was humorously novel to observe that devout sports fans or arcane academics were behaviorally indistinguishable from Trekkies or otakus. The fact of the matter is, at this point, yes, mainstream popular media is so saturated with nerdity that everyone can be a geek about something. It's equally true that if everyone can be a geek, then no one really needs to be in order to just enjoy things, and that's also good. Where the disconnect vis-a-vis the internet being stupid comes into this is that because the internet is stupid, and thus a huge amount of the conversation that takes place amid the internecine fanboys bubble circle jerk spaces is stupid, many of the loudest and dumbest voices either have yet to learn or are being willingly obtuse about, just because the whole wide world now knows all about the Avengers and Infinity Stones and Kang the Conqueror and Starro the Conqueror and the Suicide Squad and the multiverses and Celestials and Girl Thor and Wonder Man and Ultraman and One Punch Man and whatever else, every other no longer niche because everything can just be looked up and found out thing you're devoted to, doesn't mean that the same whole wide world also knows or cares about whatever very likely petty and tiresome fandom drama hang-up you've attached to it. Everyone in the world, I mean, not literally every single person, but you get the point, watches big blockbuster movies and TV shows based on DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Star Trek, Transformers, Lord of the Rings, all the stuff. Almost none of them, percentage-wise, are actually involved in the dumb internet fandom tangents or journalism/criticism drama that's not part of the real world for most people. It's just not, and I feel like they're probably better off for it. So when dipshits look at the Marvel greenlighting TV shows based on stuff like Miss Marvel, Ironheart, or Echo and start filling their diapers on 5-hour Zoomcasts like, why? Who asked for this? Blah blah blah, the comic sales numbers.
Fuck off, Ironheart. You're never gonna fill Tony's shoes, and all you're ever gonna be seen as is a cheap plastic imitation of something far better.
Look at United States of America right now. What is more important to our culture than the Joker?
I do it pretty much every day because if I don't, I will get called emotional or difficult or I might just literally get murdered.
So if we're just talking about like who gets killed in the United States, like in terms of homicide victims, I'm going to note that men get killed way more often than women. Now, that does not mean that women aren't put upon sometimes. Women now constitute the vast majority of college graduates. Women are vastly overeducated in the United States when compared to men. Women coming out of college are earning more than men are when they first get out of college. There's a vast problem with males in the United States, actually. Males are falling well behind their female counterparts in the United States. But we have to keep pushing is the idea that women are victims in the United States. They're part of the victim coalition here in the United States, and you have to hear it from She-Hulk.
Also, by the way, with The Little Mermaid, can we also just mention that just from a scientific perspective, okay, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have someone with darker skin who lives deep in the ocean.
She is the first dwarf of color.
Did she just say dwarf of color? Oh my God, she said dwarf of color.
Have you ever noticed how there are two phone books? A white one and a yellow one? Like, what's the deal with that?
One's residential, the other is business.
Oh. Well, that makes sense. What are they thinking next? Blue pages?
They have those. They're government listings.
I see.
Nobody cares about comic sales numbers, guys. Not at the kind of numbers they do versus the size of the companies that own the rights to these IP. Comic book shops are fucking toy stores that also stock multi-page ads for movies that Warner and Disney might make in a few years, and the number one thing produced by every physical publishing industry right now are new euphemisms for the term, "we're in a transitional phase." Projects like those get green lights because the big studios have demo data telling them this is what the target needs to be, this is where the people are at right now, and they probably know better than dipshit YouTubers like you or me for that matter. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, social media, the coverage, the discourse, or whatever else are not the audience, not the people, not the real world in any sense, not even close. The internet has always been a poor representation of reality in terms of its ability to actually showcase what people are thinking in the real world for obvious reasons of class and technological access, but it's only gotten worse thanks to all the tools that were supposed to make it more representative, ironically enough. Only 6.1% of people in the world use Twitter, for example. 6.1%! Yet it's constantly cited in the news media as a barometer of cultural taste, trends, and so forth, not because anyone thinks that 6.1% is even close to a representative sample, but because it's a social media site that's used by a lot of celebrities and, more relevantly, people in the news media itself as a social networking space, so they're familiar with it.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
Same deal with YouTube. It's the most used video platform at this point, yeah, but not everyone uses it actively in a networking, social upload and download sense. Most people don't comment, don't interact, don't post their own content, etc. Basically, the internet and its various hubs of content, information, and media discussion are widely disseminated. The actual vision of those discussion spaces are incredibly narrow and bubbled off from one another, and the day-to-day reality of reality. It's like that famous story about Pauline Kael, the great New York movie critic of the 70s, saying that she couldn't understand how Richard Nixon had won the presidency in 1972 since nobody she knew had voted for him. This after Nixon had won 49 out of 50 states, including hers.
Kael was actually being misquoted there. For the record, I'll try to put the real quote or the context up if I can get it. She wasn't actually expressing bewilderment in the original quote. She was in truth acknowledging her own sense of detachment from the common readership, but the point remains the same. Media discourse in the late 20th and now 21st century is too often very much disconnected, not only from the everyday world, but it's disconnected from knowing how disconnected it is. People don't know what they don't know, and what the internet doesn't know at any given point could fill another internet.
If your POV of what's happening in pop culture conversation when it comes to the audience for movies, TV, even gaming is primarily coming from the internet, by which I mean media sources, pundits, etc., who are overly invested in the internecine, internet fandom discourse between themselves rather than the reality where the actual audience, the people who just watch the stuff, like it or don't, and then go on about the rest of their kinda busy lives with other things going on, is your POV doesn't really mean shit in terms of analysis. For the last 3 years, if you were to ask the internet about the status of, say, Game of Thrones as a franchise, you probably would have been told, oh, that shit's over. Everyone hated the last season. Everyone really hated how it ended. There's a bunch of memes, jokes about how we'll never finish the last book. The only interesting thing to say is how amazing it is and how fast something so big completely falls off the cultural radar because, hey, everyone we know decided they were done with it, right? Well, as of 2 weeks ago, they launched a spin-off prequel to it in House of the Dragon, which, well, that can't succeed. The regular press knows this franchise is done for. YouTube hates it because a couple of the funny wig people are black now, and hey, what do you know? It's actually a huge ratings winner.
Dracarys.
First big piece of good news Warner Discovery's had since they've been Warner Discovery. Week 2, Episode 2 did even better. The ratings went up. That never happens. Kinda looks like out in the real world, however people were feeling about how it ended up the last time, the whole tits and dragons formula is still entirely viable. Who would have thought? Probably never stopped being the case. Now, how would you like to be the executives at other networks, and you know they exist, who almost greenlit shows like Game of Thrones a year or two ago and then didn't because, everybody says that's over now. According to the internet, the best way for Warner Brothers and AT&T, back before that all fell apart, to get a product launch off for their HBO streaming channel during the pandemic was to spend $70 million more turning Zack Snyder's already awful Justice League into a still awful but now longer and even more pointlessly pretentious and nihilistic miniseries, and the internet believed in this so much they engaged in a years-long campaign of targeted harassment to make it happen, and when they finally did, the result was the least streamed DC movie out of several to release release on the service in 2021, with additional numbers tracking that only a third of viewers actually bothered to finish watching it. Brutal. Here's a less maybe controversial example. If you look at the internet for what the biggest thing in TV is at any given time, based on what trends social media, what has big YouTube buzz, what the media class talks up, you'd probably get an impression that terrestrial cable and the networks are even worse off than they truly are, and that big, heavily advertised, viral meme genre series and adult animation that dominates the likes of Netflix, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, HBO Max, etc. are the big main thing on outside of sports and reality shows. Or when it comes to grown-up dramas, you've probably heard that the young people are big into whatever Euphoria is, because surely the hot schoolgirls getting high and fucking show is not being watched in any numbers by anyone who is not themselves a high school student. Or maybe if you follow enough of the chatter in the industries those series are about or adjacent to, you'd think that heavily talked up shows like Billions or Succession are massive. I mean, after all, those are big named actors in it, and you can't be cheap to shoot in those cities, right? And they're critically acclaimed.
Succession. This show is so popular that almost 6,000 people in New York and Los Angeles have seen it.
Surely you're joking.
I'm joking, yes, but not by a ton.
Well, looks can actually be deceiving. For one thing, Succession and Billions are acclaimed, and they do have their viewership spikes, especially when they get to their season finales, but on average they draw the same kind of numbers as the also critically acclaimed Miss Marvel, which you may have heard came in on the lower end total viewership for the MCU Disney Plus shows, but, because there's always a but, pulled higher numbers from audiences that Disney had previously had difficulty attracting to their end of the property pool in the first place, i.e. it did its job, but that's a whole other show. Anyway, step outside the cyberspace bubble and the nerd culture bubble and the politics bubble, bubbles in general, into just the terrestrial TV viewership world, and it probably won't take you too long to find out that the actual big thing on TV across the general audience spectrums is a regular cable series on Paramount called Yellowstone.
You're John Dutton, aren't you?
Yep.
I'll finish it. I'll be right back.
Don't.
A gritty, dark, kind of super over the top. Like, if I got any Canadians watching, think, what if Michael Bay made Heartland, melodrama about a family running a cattle ranch in Montana, created by Taylor Sheridan. It stars Kevin Costner, and it generally pulls between 4 and 5 million viewers on average per episode, and double that for its finales and premieres. Those are numbers that have only gone up across the soon-to-be 5 seasons that it's been on the air on the regular Paramount network. Yeah, terrestrial cable. And not only does this thing do Game of Thrones middle seasons numbers on the regular, it's not just one show, it's its own universe. They did a 1-season spin-off prequel called 1883, which was kind of like if Zack Snyder made the Oregon Trail movie, with Sam Elliott in it that did such big ratings it's getting its own spin-off next year, another prequel called 1923 that's going to have Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren, a present-day spin-off about a different ranch in Texas called 4 Sixes. There's another show from the same creator that has Jeremy Renner running a prison. I don't know if that's a tie-in or it's just being sold on having the same... This thing is a literal cash cow for Paramount right now in ratings and real dollars.
Yeah, but the internet and internet media culture discourse has basically no idea that any of this exists. None. I mean, it has its own online fan presence, sure, and there's memes on Facebook, like there are for everything, but for something that's genuinely the TV success story of its era, it basically doesn't exist as far as the Twitter, YouTube commentary are concerned, outside of people who mainly use those things to talk to each other about this stuff and not much else, because that audience is largely boomers and older Gen Xers whose primary engagement with things they enjoy is, how about this? watching them rather than arguing about them in the metaverse or whatever the fuck. I mean, that, and despite being a gnarly cowboy hats and guns show, the producers have done an astonishingly next-level good job of keeping it from becoming one of these culture war politicized things. Yeah, there, you see, nice touch with the shirt, Kevin.
Like I said, I'm not sure how fatigue about anything is supposed to work anymore in an era where media cycle turnover is measured in months and the old fatigue cycle was never actually as long as it felt like. Back in the 90s, everyone agreed that superhero movies, the entire genre, were dead as of 1997 when Batman and Robin, Steel, and Spawn all pretty much bombed between June and August of that same summer, and also everyone just kind of went along pretending Men in Black wasn't technically a comic book movie, so therefore it didn't count, which also totally would not happen today, but whatever. Anyway, everyone remembers this being the case and being absolutely true. Superhero movies, over, gone, dead to rights. Nobody wants those ever again. Public is sick of them, completely through, remember the nipples on the batsuit, etc., etc. And this was universally accepted industry truth that scorched the earth, and it lasted for exactly 1 year.
There are worse things out tonight than vampires.
Like what?
Like me.
And then Blade came out in 1998 and was a big, big hit. And then the X-Men movies started up in 99, and then Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy and a whole new wave of Marvel adaptations of varying quality followed. Warner Brothers made a new Superman and a trilogy of new Batmans, and just as that looked like it might wind down a little bit, Iron Man came out, and now here we all are today. So where was the death exactly? Because a 1 year pause between 97 and 98, during which a bunch of that stuff that came after was in development or production, doesn't sound a lot like death. It sounds like dips and rises on a timeline, which is what it is. And that also goes for action movies, romantic comedies, horror movies, westerns, sci-fi, the Star Wars franchise, and other things that have been declared gone, dead, over, or non-starters at up and down points all along that same period. It's like when people say Jaws and Star Wars themselves brought back big silly action movies as studio cash cows at the end of the 70s, while ignoring that the studios had been making a killing on big silly action stuff all throughout the 70s in the form of disaster movies like The Towering Inferno, Earthquake, Poseidon Adventure, Airport, Avalanche, The Swarm, Flood. Jaws and Star Wars didn't so much rediscover the blockbuster, they returned the blockbuster from being solely bloated star vehicles for middle-aged audiences to once again being a cool hip thing for younger audiences. Nothing really went anywhere. The media and cultural cycle turned over, and that was before the internet was compressing time from years to weeks and without the mouse keeping its properties perpetually in the conversation via theme parks and merchandise so that nothing ever goes away anymore.
You're Peter.
Yeah. Peter Parker.
Now, does that come to a summary point about anything after all that? I don't actually know, guys. I don't necessarily know that I have an end point to all of this or a moral to draw for it, because that would require there being an end to something that I just got done opining doesn't really have an end point to it. There's no spot where I can plant down a flag and say, well, now that that's over, let's look back and survey what's happened, because it's obviously an ongoing thing. The only thing I know for sure is that the internet is stupid.
He said it! He said it!
And it never actually knows anything. And the only fatigue I'm feeling is at being asked about fatigue. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.